Welcome to the sustainability webinar. This evening, we're privileged to have Demarus Tevuk give us a talk on sustainability from the Native American perspective. And she is very well qualified to talk about this subject. She's a Inupiaq herself from Alaska. We're privileged to have her among us down here in Washington. She's our gift now. So she has a background in ecology and sustainability, and she knows a lot about plants and bees and how the environment really works. And she's going to weave that scientific knowledge in with her knowledge of Native American culture and the ancient traditions that have been built up over thousands of years, and tell us something about sustainability from a unique perspective. So I give you Demarus Tevuk.
Thanks, Kurush. I'm going to share my screen. And tonight's talk is called Defining Sustainability from the Indigenous Perspective. And my name is Demarus Tevuk. I am an engagement strategist with Sustainable Seattle. And I just started that job a little under a month ago, or about a month ago, I guess. And I'd like to do a quick land acknowledgement. I live on the ancestral homeland of the Snoqualmie tribe, and I would just like to recognize the ancient relationship that they have with this place. I feel really lucky to be here, and I encourage everyone to get to know the tribes of the ancestral homelands where you live. And I totally forgot to make a slide about that. There are some cool tools out there that you can use to find the tribes of the area that you live, where you live. Okay, now I have to figure out how to make this work. My pointer is different. Let's see. I don't know if I have to do that each time. Oh, okay. Sorry. So today's talk is hosted by the Sustainable Resource Committee, which I'm a member, and we're dedicated to promoting sustainable community environments within the greater Snoqualmie Valley that seek to lean forward into the future and not only survive, but thrive. We are committed to relationship building among people and groups, as well as among people and nature. The work of this committee primarily involves supporting and connecting with farmers, educators in both academic and indigenous cultures, and other like-minded individuals. This free informational talk is a part of a series of activities towards our goal of building a sustainable community in the Snoqualmie Valley. And before I get started with the presentation, I just kind of like to do a quick overview of what we'll do tonight. I will give my presentation, and we will do a Q&A at the very end. So if you could take notes of the questions that you have, and I'll answer them at the end. And then after the Q&A is done, we'll have a little social time. This talk is also being recorded for people that missed it, and I'll be sharing the recording on YouTube later. So I like to start by talking about myself and my journey through life. I am Inupiaq. I was born in Nome, Alaska. I've got this little map showing the places that I've lived. And Inupiaq means real people or traditional people. And I grew up with a set of traditional values, and we had a poster similar to the one that I've put here, hanging up in my house throughout my childhood. And I always felt like we were practicing sustainability when we were gathering plants, especially in Alaska. And every place that I lived was either right across the river from a reservation or in a traditional village site. So I lived in Virginia, South Dakota, Iqaluit, in Nunavut, and I went to high school in Neah Bay on the Makah Reservation. And every place that I lived, I saw a lot of similarities between the cultures, even though the landscapes were really different. And so I'd like to explain a little background about my college experience. I had some frustration and some inspiration from some of the classes that I took. In 2005, I did a credit, no credit lecture series that was about attaining a sustainable society. And sustainability was kind of a hot new word at the time, and Jared Diamond's book, Collapse, had just been published. And I have a lot of issues with Jared Diamond because a lot of his ideas are pretty old-fashioned and pretty much racist. Like, it's kind of hard to explain the problems that I had. And the lecture series was really interesting, but at the end of it, I felt like the definition of sustainability was never solid. But I had this intuitive feeling that I knew what sustainability was. I just couldn't explain it. And I took a break from college for about 10 years while I raised my children. I went back to UW, and in 2015, I took a 3-credit collaborative lecture series. We did a lot of work together in groups, and it was actually, we were still reading Collapse, and the excerpts that were taken from the book where Jared Diamond was saying corporations have to, they are legally bound to give profit to their shareholders. And he was just defending this. And I was really frustrated by that. Because I also felt like his book, he had a lot of good information, but he also didn't have any real things to take away from what research he did. I ended up feeling like I saw a common thread throughout the stories that he told, that he never came to that same conclusion. So these classes really inspired me to come up with my research question, which is, what can we learn from Indigenous people about sustainability? And this presentation came out of my capstone with the program on the environment for my degree in environmental studies at the University of Washington. And so what I did to answer this question is I did academic research by looking at sources that discussed traditional knowledges, also known as traditional ecological knowledge, Indigenous knowledge. It's also sometimes called native science. And I also conducted some interviews with my peers, people that are Indigenous, but I also did an internship with the EPA and conducted interviews with them. So I'd like to give a little background by talking for a minute about Native American philosophy. And this is a really great book that I found at a secondhand store called How It Is, the Native American Philosophy of V.F. Cordova. And some of these ideas came out of this book. In the Native worldview, humans are a key part of nature. Nature is abundant, changing and flowing. Nature is also very giving. And every person has a role to play in the world. Space is spherical and time is cyclical. In the Western worldview, humans tend to be viewed as apart from nature. I wish I had more time to go into that because this is something that I called the cynical worldview. Nature is static, unchanging, it's constrained and restrictive. And then your hierarchy, your place can determine your role in the world. And it's kind of sad because this tends to mean that there are groups of people that don't feel like they have anything to contribute. Space is linear and time is sequential. And the reason why I wanted to talk about these differences in worldview is because we end up with sustainability being viewed as a new word. So I use Google's Ngram tool to look through every written published work to search for the words sustainability and sustainable. And this is a graph of the incidence of those words. The word sustainable and sustainability, both of these words, they claim to have been invented or started to be used in 1969 during the formation of the Environmental Protection Agency. But I like to argue that, okay, so the dictionary definition of sustainability is that sustainability is a noun, and the dictionary definition is that it's the ability for something to be maintained at a certain rate or level. And when you have sustainability defined as a noun, you end up with over 300 different definitional terms of sustainability. That quote is actually from the late 80s, so the number might actually be bigger than that now. And from the classes that I took, sustainability was presented as this unknown future state, and there's no clear path to how to attain that desired future state. But I like to argue that sustainability is actually an ancient concept because it's just a fact that all cultures have faced the need to learn how to live sustainably in their homelands. And there's archaeological evidence of the establishment of the Northwest coastal culture as sustainable and kind of pinnacle more than 3,000 years ago. The Tsimshian sustainably harvest their rivers for fish for over 9,000 years. I think the same can be said for a lot of different tribes for their fishing management across North America, South America, even around the world. And the village of Nook, Alaska was formed over 4,000 years ago. It's one of my favorite places to visit. You can still see the sod home foundations of that village. And I just wanted to reinforce the fact that tribes really know sustainability. This is a quote from President Obama in November of 2009. He said, "We have a lot to learn from your nations in order to create the kind of sustainability in our environment that we so desperately need." So when we look at traditional knowledge, it's actually made up of 3 pillars because traditional knowledge is holistic and the information is interconnected. So the 3 pillars are the knowledge itself, which tends to be qualitative information like the health of a system, practice or policy or management protocols, like how do you use information, and then ethics that help guide that because the goal of traditional knowledge is to make decisions and do positive actions in the natural world. And so traditional knowledge really, it's an ethical science. It's one that includes ethics within the knowledge system. And I wish I could go into more time, like really dive into this table, but it takes too long to go over everything. But I would just like to try to explain some of the information here. So with traditional knowledge, the information tends to be abstract, and that's because it is context-based. It's based on, the answer is going to be based on who you ask, when you ask, who you are. So you can ask the same question to different people and you'll get different answers. So that's why traditional knowledge tends to be described as being abstract. The information is qualitative because it's systems-based. So it's more about the health of a system versus the number of creatures or what products you can get out of the system. The information is inclusive because we want every person to have access to the information so that they all behave properly in nature. And there is a lot more reliance on intuitive thought processes. And I just want to point that out because I think that's something that is really kind of difficult for scientific ecological knowledge systems to kind of comprehend the idea of relying on intuitive process. The traditional knowledge is holistic. It includes every kind of component. It's about people, plants, the ecosystem, water, physics. The view of coexistence with nature is a really important component too, because in Western scientific systems, one of the goals is to have control over the natural systems, where traditional knowledge really has this goal of living in harmony with nature. And I just like to point out that this is another source that reinforces that people are a part of nature, and so we really value reciprocity. And in the end, traditional knowledge, the output of the information is action. It's what do you do with now that you know this information, whereas with scientific knowledge, the output tends to be content. That's why it's quantitative. So in my thesis, context is really key. With Western science, the goal is for the information to be objective and clinical. The knowledge is content or quantitative, and you end up with sustainability defined as a goal. And in native science, ethics are included in the system. The information is action, and you end up with sustainability being defined as a path. It's the steps that you take to get to that state. And both of these knowledge systems, they're equal and complementary, and they really are stronger together. But the next step in incorporating both systems is really to maintain the context of native science. That means you can't remove the ethical values from the system. And it really means that you have to keep knowledge bearers at the forefront. You have to remember that every time you ask a question, you might get a different answer. Sorry. Every time I do these talks, my nose starts to run. So with Indigenous sustainability, we're starting to form a little better definition here. It's about creating abundance in our natural resources, because the goal is to do positive action in the natural world. So the Indigenous ideal of sustainability is that it's a verb. It's a thing that you do. Native science is also defined by action, and this is a really great book that just talks all about the fact that native science is based on action. It's called Who's Asking? Native Science, Western Science, and Science Education. One of the co-authors, I'm not sure, is Megan Bang at the University of Washington. So I really like to focus on the values that inform an ethical science. And these ethical values are viewed as a gift. They're lessons from nature. And they're a set of standards of behavior and actions that we need to take And that's what I'm going to really get into today. So I came up with some parameters for what would qualify as an Indigenous sustainable value. They have to be holistic and inclusive of needs of not just human beings, but of the ecosystem, plants and animals, other communities. The values need to be traditional. They are the bedrock or the foundation of the culture. They're unchanged, even in the face of some of the policies that tribes have gone through with genocide, assimilation, boarding schools, everything. The values have to be homogeneous across North America. And that's something that I experienced when I was growing up and living in all of these different places across North America. The values have to be forward thinking, and that's why 7 generations is so important. They have to be proactive because our human actions, they do impact nature. And the values really should unify the community. So these are the Indigenous sustainable values that I defined in my research paper: relationship building, respect, responsibility, reciprocity or sharing, appreciation, low consumption, or taking only what you need. And I'm going to discuss each of these values. So first is relationship building. Central to Indigenous culture is the importance of building and maintaining relationships. And because we have a holistic worldview, humans are a part of nature, and relationships include those between humans, animals, plants, ecosystems, and communities. It's even between things that are considered unliving, like rocks or a river. So relationships also work in both ways. It's not just from humans to nature, but also nature back to humans, because natural systems can speak to us and teach humans as well. And the phrase, all my relations, reminds the community of relationship building during ceremony and gatherings. This is why this phrase is invoked very often. So respect is another core concept that permeates Indigenous consciousness. Respect is extended beyond your family to elders, community, ancestors, and to nature. Respect really is a foundation of relationship building, because good relationships don't happen without respect and humility. And it's also a big part of the concept to respect the needs of the 7 generations. That's the whole point of bringing up the concept of 7 generations, is that we have to remember to respect the needs of people that came before and after us. Responsibility. A strong sense of responsibility for one's actions is taught to all children from a really young age. And obligations to family members and the natural world are needed to maintain good relationships. And our community members model responsibility through their words and their actions. And the responses within natural systems are viewed as a reflection if inadequate actions or irresponsibility happens. I just like to point this out because this is going to come up in a quote in a little bit. So reciprocity is the act of giving or sharing gifts from the natural world, and gifts are also given back to nature. Reciprocity really builds relationships. It shows thankfulness through sharing. It shows responsibility to each other, and it shows respect. And I wish I had more time to go into reciprocal economies. And the view of reciprocal economies in Indigenous culture is a little different than some of the definitions that I've seen. But the economic incentives of reciprocity encourages the responsibility of resource management, because reciprocity reduces the incentive to harvest too much. If everyone is getting gifts freely from the earth, then there's no need to to be greedy and take more than you need. And Northwest Coastal Reciprocal Economies, they distribute the wealth to the benefit of their communities, and gifts are given without requirements of status or any kind of expectation of return. And I show this picture of a plate of traditional food from Alaska because it's a really good example of my mom participating today in a reciprocal economy where she exchanges resources, but she's also using social capital during those exchanges. So showing appreciation is central to prayer and ceremony, and thankfulness is also practiced during hunting and gathering. When I pick berries, I'm thanking the plants like constantly, and I'm so grateful to the weather and the bees that pollinated and the flowers growing, becoming berries, and it's just this overwhelming feeling of appreciation and thankfulness. And appreciation reinforces all of these other values because it's respectful, it's an act of responsibility. It really builds upon the relationship that you have with nature, and it shows reciprocity between humans and natural systems. So when I'm picking berries or gathering plants, I'm thanking the plants for providing for me. And gifts of food, clothing, and tools, they're all recognized as gifts that are ultimately sourced from nature. So the Indigenous definition of conservation really translates into low consumption. And the proverb that you'll hear pretty often is take only what you need. And I really like this quote. Before I leave, I found out who I want to help, who I want to give to. That tells you how much I need. That tells me how much I need. You just feel it. You know when you have enough. You don't shoot animals you have no use for. If you're going to treat nature like that, she can come back on you twice as hard. This is Colin Nelson, and he's Simpson. And I just like to point out how this quote is talking about intuition, but that the fact that, and that doesn't easily translate into Western knowledge systems. It feels a little kind of foreign, but you just kind of have to think about what do you need for the winter? Who are you helping to provide for? How much do they need? And then that helps you figure out how much to gather. And you also have to take a look at what the area is able to provide. And I totally forgot until now that I really wanted to kind of give a warning about the information that I provide tonight. That, like, I'm being mindful of the fact that I just can't teach you how to gather sustainably, because the information really matters on where you are and what you're gathering. And so I think non-Indigenous people tend to take Indigenous knowledge and think that they can apply it to other things, and it just doesn't work, because Indigenous knowledge really is context-based. It really is based on the land. It's based on what you're talking about. So I really like this quote about natural law as a way to kind of show how all of these values work together. Natural law is a way of living in the world that is governed by nature and tied to our native language, creation stories, songs, and ceremonies. Natural law teaches us to give reverence, have gratitude, and never waste these resources. The natural law is to take only what is needed and to leave the rest, and to offer thanks to Creator for providing our traditional foods. And that is by Shelley Vendiola of the Swinomish Climate Change Initiative. It's a really great document. I'd like to quickly talk about how all of these values are taught and reinforced. All of the values are taught to younger generations. They're a part of creation stories. like I said before, our community leaders are expected to lead by action. There is also a set of social norms with the traditional values, and that includes a traditional justice system that is pretty different than the one we have now. And the values are, they're also expressed during ceremony. And this Dreaming of Sheep in Navajo Country is a really great book as a source of creation stories, but also this book talks a lot about the fact that the way that you think really, before you act, the way that you think is really important. And in order to live well in the world, we need to have good thoughts. I'd also like to point out that the How It Is book there's a nice little example of a story of how some of our traditional knowledge is not taught through language. It's taught through, how does she describe it? It's through our behavior, it's through unspoken behavior. And those things were really unchanged, even with assimilation and boarding school and all of the awful things that have happened to Indigenous people across North America. I also would like to point out that this book helps me understand why Indigenous people like to provide context of their own lives. It's because traditional knowledge is all, I keep saying that it's about context, it's really about your perspective and trying to understand the other person's perspective, because the information comes from the land, it comes from their families, it comes from their experiences. So when I describe myself at the beginning of the presentation, it's not because I'm a narcissist, it's because I just need to give you the background so that you understand where my perspective is coming from. And that book really explains that really well. So I'd like to point out the concepts of selfishness and greed, because every other traditional value is positively reinforced. These are things that we want people to do. But in order to be avoided and deterred, selfishness and greed are the only negative behaviors that are warned against so that they can be discouraged. These are the only behaviors that are negatively reinforced, because selfish behavior destroys relationships. It's a form of disrespect, and it doesn't allow for any reciprocity to happen. Greed also does not allow the expression of appreciation for nature's gifts, and greed drives people to disobey natural law. And givers are taught not to expect a gift in return, because that expectation in itself would be a selfish and greedy behavior. So as part of my research, I wrote 4 case studies with my internship with the EPA. I was working with the Region 10 office, which is headquartered in Seattle. And my 4 case studies were the Suquamish, Nooksack, Jamestown S'Klallam, and Sitka tribe of Alaska. And some of the people that I interviewed were non-native natural resource managers, but I still asked everyone, how was traditional knowledge used during this project? So let's quickly go over these case studies. The Suquamish have an ocean acidification education program, and they focus a lot on advocacy and stewardship. Traditional knowledge included traditional knowledge and traditional Suquamish language in the biology class. This is also an example of reciprocity, because all of the educational information was provided for free through the grants that they had with the local school district. In the Nooksack, the South Fork of the Nooksack River was part of a pilot qualitative report using high temperatures as something that's called the total maximum daily load. So it's really using high temperature of the river, which kills young salmon. That high temperature is considered a pollutant in that definition. And this this report also looked at the future impacts of climate change, which was one of the first times that they've done something like that. And the traditional knowledge used was the past natural conditions were used to inform the models of climate change. With the Jamestown Sklallam, they created a community-geared climate change adaptation plan, and they used a lot of guidance from elders, and traditional knowledge has really informed the key areas of concern for effects of climate change. And with the Sitka tribe of Alaska, they created a harmful algal bloom monitoring program. And this program was all about capacity building and training people how to monitor those to see if the algal blooms are happening. And the goal was really subsistence safety. This was another example of reciprocity because there actually were no testing sites in the southeast area of Alaska. And it was not just subsistence for Native communities, but also for shellfish farmer collectors that are non-Native were also able to use the benefits of this program. And I like to keep this part of my presentation, even though I wasn't required to do it, because the significance of the interviews is that I really empowered the knowledge systems by asking how traditional knowledge was used during these programs. And some of the non-Native managers, they showed an adoption of Indigenous sustainable values. And that adoption is a marker of success in natural resource projects. And that is not something that I think, that's a quote from a paper. And we can empower traditional knowledge by maintaining the components, the three pillars, by keeping the ethical values as part of the knowledge system so that we can honor Native people's goals with the information. So my definition of traditional sustainable values is that they guide us to sustainability, which in my definition is that in harmony with nature, we create abundance and stability in nature for the health of ourselves and our animal and plant relatives. And I just circle back to recapping that these are the sustainable values that I covered tonight: relationship building, respect, responsibility, reciprocity, appreciation, and low consumption. And I've been thinking about how these values, they work together as an interwoven set. And if you're missing some of these values, you actually end up having a toxic relationship, which I think is the way that our capitalist system is operating, like completely opposite of all of these values. So Kuyana for listening to tonight's talk. September's talk, I'm not sure about the date exactly, but Matt Irwin is going to be teaching us how to forage for wild mushrooms. And I have one last slide that I'll leave up. If anyone would like to send me a donation to show appreciation for tonight's talk, my Venmo is on the screen. And we can start some Q&A.
Thank you so much. Do we want to go back to gallery view now?
Sure, stop sharing.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we'll continue recording.
Sure. And I don't know how we want to manage the question and answer portion. If we want to do like raise your hand or maybe through chat.
Yeah. anyone has a question, they can either type it in chat or just say that I have a question, and then you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
If no one else is going to jump in, I will. I guess this is kind of off topic, but at the very start, he said that you knew about the bees and the native bees, and I am really into working in native plants to support the native bees. And I read that some of our native bees are generalists and they'll use a wide range of flowers, which is great. But I also read that there were specialists, but they didn't say which species the specialists actually had the relationship with. And I was wondering if you had that knowledge.
Yeah, I know about that, but there's only a couple of examples that There's only a couple of examples of bees and plants that I know. And one good example is there's camas, the purple flower, which is edible. And I've seen bumblebees, which are generalists on that plant. There is the death camas version, which is toxic. And I've heard that even the pollen and nectar can be toxic in the flowers. There is a death camas specialist bee that only visits death camas. And they're actually, I don't know if they're on the endangered list, but I think that they're facing some problems because we don't have as many camas fields as we used to, because camas used to be cultivated. I would like to see it cultivated again, but death camas would also pop up near the camas fields. It's the only example off the top of my head. I know there are others, and the best advice I have for people that want to support native bees is to plant native flowers, and especially the flowers that have been listed as threatened or endangered. Henderson checker mallow is a really good example of an endangered flower. And that's because that is a flower that likes to grow in estuaries. So think about plants that are where their ecosystems have been degraded and there's less of that type of ecosystem. If you could plant those kinds of flowers, then that will help support your local native bee population. The only other tip that I could give is that native bees actually have a really short flying range of only a few hundred feet. So the native bee that you're trying to support, it might not exist exactly where you are, but just keep planting the plants and hopefully they'll come back.
Demarus, there's a question in the chat that says, do you have a book resource list that you can share? Pamela took notes, but she's not sure she caught them all. Do you have a list that you could share?
Yeah, if you give me a second, I can look for I have my senior paper is up on academia, and that includes the annotated bibliography in the back. The only thing is this How It Is book was something that I found after I was done with school. This is I don't know how easy it is to find this book. I found it it's secondhand, like it's got writing all over the inside. But yeah, I can find my link to my paper.
Maybe after the Q&A, you can post it in the chat.
Okay.
And then there's another question from Ron White. Can you speak a bit about how the loss of native values and knowledge is contributing to the fire situation in California?
Yeah, I actually just saw a news article about that recently. I don't think it's a loss of the values and knowledge. It's a loss of the relationship that Native people have with the land. It's a loss of their management ability. Like the knowledge is still there. It's just they haven't been allowed to practice it. And it feels awful to say this too, but some places the Native population might be small enough that some of the knowledge bearers were lost. And the way to regain the knowledge is to train the younger generation. That's when you can have, from one tribe to another, reteach those lost, the lost information. Oh, and someone found my paper and put it in the chat. That includes the bibliography at the end.
Thank you, Miriam. That was very kind for doing that. And she also asked, how do you feel about non-native people adopting this set of values and teaching ethical foraging and tending?
So I have some mixed feelings. I want people to adopt these traditional values. I also want people to acknowledge that we don't have to start from scratch when we want to find a way to live sustainably. Yeah, the thing I am not sure about how accurate the ethical foraging and tending is. And yeah, the only way to really, like I said, is to maintain traditional knowledge is to have the knowledge bearers present. So if you can find foragers that are traditional knowledge bearers and pay them to teach you how to forage for that particular plant in that area, then that's the best way to do it. Otherwise, I'm not sure, because I'm in foraging groups, and I've recently seen people say, here's a blanket statement for how to forage ethically, and then they give a quantitative number, and that doesn't work with traditional knowledge. It's qualitative, it's intuitive. So you can't just have blanket statements about how to forage ethically or properly. It really has to come directly from a knowledge bearer. And that can be hard to do. It has to happen in person. Written traditional knowledge doesn't really work all that great, because you come into that issue of not being able to keep the context, the background, because year to year, a place can change and the health of the system can be different than how it was before. So there's a lot of complex parts to traditional knowledge that it just doesn't translate in writing.
Oh, Pamela, thank you for posting the link for how to get the book, How It Is.
Oh, my brother Dwighty is saying that, yes, this meeting is being recorded, and I will post the recording on my private YouTube channel.
And I'll send out.
It will be available publicly.
I'll send out the link that Demarus generates, and I'll send it to everyone who's registered for this class. And then Eleanor asks, in your interviews with the non-native resource managers, were there any things, concepts, ideas that you noticed that they were all missing that you wish they knew regarding traditional environmental knowledge?
Yeah, I think it's, most of the time it has to do with these differences in worldviews, because it doesn't translate well. If you think of time being cyclical and space is spherical, and where traditional knowledge is a whole system, where in Western knowledge, everything is compartmentalized and taken apart and put into a box. And so that can make it hard to it feels like it's hard to go from information that's separated into a box back into a whole system. I think there tends to be, what tends to get in the way is the overall worldview. Trying to think of a good example. Especially like this idea that nature doesn't change, that there's a static state, that like here's the pinnacle ecological like a old growth forest, when the traditional view is that nature is changing, a tree's going to fall over, or there'll be a flood or a landslide, like something's going to change and happen. That's what usually is missing.
Question from Anna Clark. I get. Hold on, let me just. I don't know where they're
What do I mean by spherical space beyond considering the ecosystems? I think spherical space is related to thinking holistically, thinking like as a whole system. I think, and that is one of the harder ideas to kind of explain, that Western worldview is of space being linear, like a timeline or a flat, like a piece of paper. And then that things are related to each other on a line instead of related in a sphere. There's also this idea of circular thinking that I learned about in college, which was kind of funny, but it's not exactly the same idea, but I think Native people tend to see it as like, I think in a circle, like I think in a whole sphere.
Bridget has her hand up. I'm sorry, I missed that before, Bridget. Please unmute yourself and speak if you'd like.
That's okay, thank you. Demarus, first of all, thank you very much. I've really appreciated everything that you've gone over so far. I have kind of a long worded question, hopefully just bear with me. I work for a nonprofit river conservation organization, and I have endless stakeholder meetings where we're discussing XYZ projects. And oftentimes there are natural resource managers there who are representing tribes, but they're not tribal members, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times I feel like we get so bogged down in these quantitative details, and it feels like it's not my place to bring up any concerns about, you know, how are we actually involving Indigenous values, considering I'm not the tribal representative, and there are tribal representatives present. So I guess my question is, what kinds of things do you wish were happening in these stakeholder meetings, and what kind of advice would you give to me as someone who's trying to make sure that I'm being respectful and aware of traditional knowledge in a space where there are tribes present, but it just kind of feels like we're just getting bogged down in these, like, the temperature of the water is XYZ and you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think taking that information and remembering, trying to think of how to translate it into the health of the system. Also, so my case study with the Inupiaq is a really good example of what you're talking about. That natural resource manager was non-native, but he was the most, how do I describe it? Like, he was the most, I can't find the words. He was just so passionate about the legacy impacts on the river from logging and returning the river to its natural state, moving roads away from the floodplain, because if we don't do it now, it's going to happen naturally and we're going to waste a lot of money. So I think if you remind yourself to think about what is the whole system of the river, what was its previous healthy state, and how do we get to that healthy state in the future? What do the fish need? Like, what do the animals that use the river need? What do the birds, the plants, and how do we recreate that natural healthy system? I know engineered log jams are a big tool that's used, but yeah, it's just trying to think of the whole picture. And yeah, it's just hard because the natural resource managers have been trained to think one way, and you want them to think in a totally different way. That's been discouraged, really. Yeah, it's more about viewing the health of the system and helping it get to a healthy place.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense.
Aurora the Water thanks you for sharing your knowledge. This talk, she says, gives me a few more tools to explain how I gain my knowledge and how I teach. I will be sharing your recorded video when appropriate. Thanks.
You're welcome. Thanks for coming. Hey, there's Rose.
Hi, I'm sorry I missed your presentation. I hope it's on recorded somewhere. If it's been documented, please share it with me. Thanks.
Yeah, I will.
All right.
I'm glad you're here, though.
Last few minutes. Good to see you.
Hey, Demarus, Bridget, thank you so much for this talk. We really enjoyed it. And I have a question for you. So I grow plants, native plants for restoration, and work with a lot of people that are doing restoration work in the Snoqualmie Valley. And one of the things that has sort of come to my attention thinking about sustainability and how we sort of respect the long indigenous presence on this land is like the work that we're doing is so different. It's such a different relationship to nature than has happened in the past, because there's been so much like sort of change and, in a negative way, destruction, ruining. And so like the path forward, the work that we're doing, like growing plants in a nursery in plastic containers in this sort of sterile environment, and, planting plants out in like a specific grid pattern and tending for them. It's so different than the relationship that people have had with plants, and animals in the past on this land. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how to navigate that from your perspective, as far as trying to kind of uphold these indigenous values and be respectful of the land that we're working on.
Yeah, that's there's one idea that I kind of wish I had more time to talk about, is that sustainability should really be easy. Like it should almost be mindless, where it's like you're thinking of like what's the thing that takes the least amount of work to get it done. And yeah, I think one thing you could do is to talk to the plants, like even if it was silently. I know that if that might be weird around your coworkers or something, but that will help with the feeling this connection with the plants as you plant them. And I always think of plants as having personalities or characteristics, like where does the plant want to live? And I know that you're doing that with the restoration work, but like that's kind of how I approach gardening. I haven't been all that great at it. I'm also like, I don't like watering. Like I just kind of put stuff there, and then if it survives, then yay. But yeah, I know it's hard too, because some restoration work, you have to think about future climate change. Like something might not be able to become established because climate change is already here, and you have to move it in a different location than it was before. And then the traditional knowledge about the past conditions that won't really apply anymore. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like some of the plants that are easier to kind of work with are ones that give us something too, like food or medicine or fiber. And as a, not saying that the other plants don't have value, it just feels like it's just easier to connect with them.
Thank you.
Hi, Kathy, go ahead.
Hi, hello from Pennsylvania. I'm trying to think of how to word the question. It seems to me that you're talking about common indigenous wisdom and values, and I'm wondering, I'm part of an interfaith group, and we're doing a talk next month about how our faiths inform our relationship with nature. And it seems to me that the faiths or religions of the indigenous groups are more closely linked to the culture and the group than Western groups. You know, so I was wondering about the diversity of the faiths and beliefs that inform this wisdom, or is it all linked to the culture and the group?
So the Sustainable Resource Committee is made up of members of the Baha'i faith here in our area, and I grew up with the Baha'i faith. I'm also a Baha'i, and but the Baha'i faith is a faith that supports culture. So I also grew up with, it wasn't exactly, yeah, my traditional way of praying is a little different than some other cultures. It's expressing thankfulness. And I don't have a lot of, I didn't really look at traditional religious sources for my paper, but ceremony and gathering, like speeches, those are ways to reinforce the traditional values. So there is overlap with the faith of the different tribes. Does that answer your question?
It does. I have the feeling we could talk for hours about the faiths, the different groups that you worked with. So I'm wondering about the diversity of those faiths and how that maps onto the fact that there are these common values that come out of the group.
Yeah, and the places that I grew up had really, really different landscapes. Like I was born in Alaska, and then we lived in Vermont and Virginia for a little while, and then we lived in South Dakota on the plains, and then we lived in Arctic Canada, and then I went to high school in Nia Bay, like right on the coast. So even though these landscapes are really different, I would hear these common values. They were reinforced. They're still being reinforced during ceremony and gatherings like powwows or dances, celebrations. all of these values get brought up. And that's something I wish I forgot. I keep forgetting, like, once you know about these values, you'll see them repeated. There's a pattern. Like and every time there's reciprocity, respect, I underline it. Like it's being talked about because it's important, because it guides us.
Thank you.
I think that if anyone else has any other questions, I think we might be done with the Q&A portion.
Thank you everyone for attending the talk and participating so actively in the question and answer session. We look forward to seeing you next month. And so if you registered for this webinar, your email is recorded. I will send you, when Demarus makes the YouTube link available, I will send everyone the YouTube link so you can watch it again or share it with your friends. And then you'll also get the another reminder to register for the next month's webinar. So I want to thank everyone for attending this evening. Please feel free to stay on if you would like to just socialize. Thank you.
Yes, thanks everyone for coming, and you're welcome.